time based on their relative power. So basically, since the 1970s, or really the 80s, government unions have been very strongly opposed to constitutional conventions, but in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when they were weak, they were great advocates for the process. Basically, at the time it was business, big business, especially the trusts, the railroads, and the groups that had tremendous control of our legislatures were opposed, and the more populist groups favored them. And much of what people fear losing from a constitutional convention came in the New Deal Convention of 1938. That's when labor got its pension and other rights and was a great champion of the institution. Now that they have been very successful with the legislature, they prefer that mechanism and they mistrust this mechanism. So the politics have evolved. Unfortunately, it has evolved in a very unfavorable way. I've an essay on how the politics have evolved since 1777 to the present. I mean, in Arthax of Loomis's day, you had 50% turnover in the legislature. Farmers were by far the most common type of legislature. They were not career politicians. They didn't make their money they didn't look as this is a career. Legislations have always been opposed to conventions, but the level of opposition when you have a professional legislature is much greater. And early on, you had maybe big business that had a lot at stake with it opposed, and now you have the legislatures, you have big business and big labor. It's sort of like impossible politically, this institution, in the last few decades, when you have that type of very sophisticated opposition. So that's a big change. A critical element in the politics is the no campaigns focused on the second part of the process, the delegate selection. I don't want to talk about the third part, the popular ratification. So that's just in the framing. We're going to talk a lot about the potential corruption in the second part. The third part is sort of awkward because both legislative initiated amendments and constitutionally initiated amendments have to be ratified. So if you attack that part of the process, you're really attacking all types of constitutional amendments. So I would argue that the most critical part of the process is the third part, because if a constitutional convention is just able to propose things, and you have the right to reject them. And to me, that is the most critical step in the process, that final one. But if you look at how it's debated publicly, you'd often never know that third step exists, because there's so much focus on the second step. So, and then the last point I'd like to make is that the no campaigns tend to say that the Constitutional Convention mechanism is a substitute, not a complement, meaning you can substitute legislative initiative amendment for a Constitutional Convention, and obviously this. So these are importantly different types of institutions. They're complements, and you can't say that, we have this other system that's more efficient that can solve the same type of problems that a Constitutional Convention was designed. So those are four critical political differences, and I'd like to close with, we got a quote earlier from Winston Churchill. This is a different Winston Churchill, and Winston Churchill said that democracy was the worst form of government, except all the other forms that have been tried from time to time. And I think that sort of encapsulates my view of the state constitutional convention. It's the only mechanism we have in New York to bypass the legislature and propose an amendment. It isn't a perfect system like democracy isn't, but it's the only one we have. And if you're throwing it out, the baby with the bathwater. The goal, if there are problems with the institution, and I think New York has one of the better constitutional convention systems, partly because it leaves less discretion to the legislature, we ought to fix any problems at the next constitutional convention. But it's a vitally important institution, and like all forms of democracy, it's got some warts, but it's an institution that we should really cherish as something extraordinarily valuable. So that's it. And just on my particular interest is that I am interested in defending this institution, which gets badmouthed a lot in the day-to-day politics. I'm less focused on the things that you're probably most concerned about, which is what exactly is a constitutional convention going to do or not do. I'm interested in why we have this institution and why it's incredibly valuable. We don't want to badmouth this institution. We might argue that it's not the appropriate time or something like that. But where my line is these attacks. It's like attacking democracy. A lot of people do it. You go to Russia, you go to Iran and whatnot. There are plenty of reasons that sounds sort of reasonable to attack democracy, but I don't think we should be attacking this institution as an institution. So that's where I'm coming from. And hopefully Jim will give you some more practical views. So.